Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the virtual coach house at Green College at UBC. My name is Mark Vesey. I'm the principal of the college, and it's my pleasure to introduce the first group of presenters in this series run by our Leading Scholars. The Leading Scholars program is one of the ways the college makes connections with newly appointed faculty at UBC across all disciplines. Each cohort of Green College Leading Scholars has a 2-year run, and fortunately this cohort, which is the one for 2019-2021, had a few chances to get together and talk and even have dinner at the college before the campus started emptying out in March. So while most of their communication since then has of course been by Zoom and the like, they did at least start planning this series in real time and space earlier in the year. The theme they've chosen for the series, which will run now until the spring, the next event, if you want to mark your calendars already, is November the 5th, when a visitor from Australia, Desmond Manderson, will be presenting on strange bedfellows. We think it has something to do with law and the visual arts, but there'll be more information in announcements to come. The theme for the series overall is building worlds in uncertain times, power, culture, pedagogy. And there could hardly, I think, be a more timely topic than that now for a university. Of course, those of us who live in Vancouver and work at UBC have reason every day to give thanks for the privilege of being on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples. Since I'm at Green College, at this moment, I'll make special acknowledgement for the college and for myself and others here, and give special thanks to the Musqueam people, whose achievements in the matter of world building in this place and whose hospitality in these parts are an inspiration and a daily blessing to later comers, such as the rest of us, most of us are. Now I want to hand over to Vincent Gélinas-Lemaire, who is going to set up this evening's session on narrative architecture, how storytelling builds worlds. Thank you, Leading Scholars. Over to you. Et merci, Vincent.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. I will now share our presentation. There we go. It's a pleasure to welcome you all for this first meeting that will be around the theme of narrative architecture, how storytelling builds worlds. And as we'll see together, this has been interpreted very differently by all four of the members of this group. Just before we begin, I thought it could be useful to do a very quick training in the art of Zoom meetings, because some of us are not yet acquainted with this. Yes, it's possible with this new mode of communication. So I wanted to share two details with you. If you're not used to Zoom, on the bottom left of your screen, you will see a little microphone icon. That is where you will be able to mute, as you probably are at the moment, or unmute yourself, because we will have discussion period at the end of our 4 talks. So this is where you can start speaking to the group and then turn off your microphone after your question or your intervention. We will do the same. And the second little detail that may be useful is how to raise your hand virtually, because we're at school after all. So to do so, it's quite easy. You will see there is an icon at the bottom of the screen called Participants. And by clicking it and opening this menu, it will lead you, and it will open a little white bar to the right, and there will be an option Raise Hand. By clicking it, you will be getting in line, or so to speak, to speak, and we will have a open period of questions at the end. It will be able to cover all the materials of our 4 talks, or whatever we'll be able to weave them together. And our presentation today will be shared with 4 voices. First of all, mine. I work on French literature. Then it will be followed by Elizabeth Lagresa-González, who is also a member of the Department of French, Hispanic, and Italian Studies. So 2 literary short chats to begin with. Then Julen and Etxabe, we will be talking us about worlds built through the narratives of law. So a different, an interesting segue, but that works very well in the logic of this general theme of the Green College. And we will close the day with the work of Patrick Rizzotti, because he is not only a professor here on campus, but he's also an artist, a creator, and we will see some of his constructs for the stage, which sadly at the moment we will have to live through vicariously because of a few exceptions, most are closed. So without further ado, I will begin with my intervention, which I wanted to title Literature as an Architecture. And it's probably the most abstract talk today. It is because it aims to tackle all types of narratives. And as we know, Green College is an interdisciplinary institution by nature, and so is my own approach to literature and space. My first studies, in fact, were in architecture, and I wish to carry some of the principles and perspectives between both fields. And so the driving question in my work has always been to think how space is, when I'm thinking about space, is not just what or where the space is, but also how it is built. And the word built, which is at the shares the roots with poetics, of the builder, of the artisan, is purposeful here, because literature builds worlds from the white page. And as such, it needs its own architecture with its codes, its strategies, its own materials. And indeed, space is at the heart of narratives. It is a backdrop, a decor, but it is also a living actor that directs the flow of the text, its form, its meaning. It guides the journeys, the perceptions, the fields of actions of the characters. And here we'll be talking about different literary examples, but when I talk about narrative, it can apply to philosophical narratives, to scientific ones, as long as we are building a story. And in working to understand the rules of this literary architecture, I discovered that authors have basically 5 fundamental tools at their disposal, 5 points of view on any given space that they would wield together or one by itself, depending on their aesthetics and narrative goals. A murder scene, for instance, does not need to be framed like a love scene. Most fairy tales do not share the poetic goals and means of science fiction. And so here are the tools I came up with in my research, my aspects of space. The first is the geometric. So when space is made known through measurements, shapes, and proportions, aiming at an exact schema. Space can also be given the stable characteristics of a place, it being anchored on a map, given precise borders and defining features. Space can be built in parallel to a moral notion, an abstract quality, or any other object of a storyline. It can also have a direct relationship with a character blocking or freeing its body and senses. And finally, space can be exposed through fields of knowledge that serve to its productive exploitation. And to make this a bit more concrete, let's look at a map, because that is one of the usual ways we have to think of space. And we have our first example of an old-timey map of the Gulf of Thailand, a portland, a maritime map. And as you can see, it can represent the ports and the reefs that it wants to show the navigators without being burdened by coordinates. While on the other side, we can see a geological map that erases the cities and the roads of France, as they would only distract from the data it needs to outline. In the same way, a novel can perceive and expose space through given filters and disregard others. I want to give a little more details about these filters and give you a few examples taken from literature. So this first aspect, and I won't burden you with the whole definitions every time, just with the first line is the geometric aspect. It's one that represents space through measurements, shapes, and proportions. And I wanted to give you directly an example in La Jalousie, the jealousy of Alain Robbe-Grillet, in which the narrator first appears intangible. We don't even know if he exists or if he's a disembodied voice, but he reveals his presence and his subjectivity through an obsession for precise measurements. Increasingly, his gaze comes to focus on certain details, on certain gaps, on those that separate his neighbor and his wife, because he is suspecting them of being unfaithful and is doing his own inquiry. So I'll read those two. The four hands are aligned immobile. The space between A's left hand and Frank's right hand is of approximately 10 centimeters. Having left the house at 6:30 in the morning, they should be back a little after midnight. But under the office's open window, the tiles keep trace of 8 chair legs, 2 times 4 sparkling circles, smoother than their surroundings, arranged in 2 squares. The 2 left corners of the square on the right stand merely 10 centimeters from the 2 right corners of the one on the left. A bit laborious, but these distances, which are suspiciously short, are precious clues for the narrator's emotional investigation. For, like the reader, like us, he doesn't have access to the inner lives of the other characters. Like the investigator in a crime novel, he tries to observe and to listen to the essential data that has been diluted in the masses of neutral information. Numbers here are at the heart of the plot. The second filter is what I call the localized aspect of space, and it's the one that situates, limits, or characterizes space. The 3 facets that can be aggregated by a toponym, by a place name. And I want to give you a short example borrowed from Stendhal's Le Rouge et le Noir. It unfolds in the novel's first pages, and it serves to set the stage of the story in a classical way. It includes a place name, its location, borders, and characteristics, and that in just a few sentences. The small town of Verrières could pass for one of the prettiest of the Franche-Comté. Its white houses with their pointed red-tiled roofs spread on a hillside where tufts of strong chestnut oaks signal all the curves. The Doubs River flows a few hundred feet below its fortifications, which were built long ago by the Spaniards and now stand ruined. The space name, Verrières, is invented, at least in this context, while the Franche-Comté and the Doubs are recognizable for anyone who knows this part of France. And this interplay, this in-between between the real and the invented, establishes an often unstable relationship between the fictional and the real and narratives, between the Paris of Balzac, Modiano, and Ernaud, and the one we can visit by taking a plane. The third one, the allegorical aspect of space, is quite different. Is one that serves to develop a spatial frame to make it the frame, a space to make it a frame to a representation of a person, an abstract idea, or any object. And maybe the most useful concept here would be that of home. We cannot imagine a home that is completely separated from its people. The more we know about the people, the more we know about the home, and the more we probe the home, the more doors we open, the more we get to know the interior lives of a family. And it's my studies in architecture that guided me here, thinking through the symbolic assignation of something as basic as shapes in the built world helped me translate these questions to narratives. I was interested in those shapes that were assigned strikingly fluid interpretations in successive eras. And I will use a few images to illustrate this flexibility with the simple shape of the circle in architecture. Leon Battista Alberti, an artist and architect of the Italian Renaissance, explains how the circle had been determined in antiquity to be ideal for the constructions of temples dedicated to Gaia, goddess of the earth and of fertility. The shape, the round shape, would offer a physical echo to her divine attribute, which were the globe and the maternal womb. But with the same circle, one could think also of Rome's Pantheon, whose circular shape first embodied the equality of the old gods, but that did not stop the same building from being consecrated as a Christian church in the 7th century, its rotundity then slipping without losing a stone in the process under the symbolic shroud of Mary, as it then illustrated her attributes of maternity, once again, and justice. Palladio would remark of the round shape that it is, I quote, highly suitable to the Christian cult in that its entire expanse is closed and included within a single line without beginning nor end, and that having all of its extremities equally distant from the center, it stands as a symbol of the unity, the infinity, the uniformity, and the justice of God. These shifts in meaning could continue in perpetuity, be that to note the reappropriation of geometric purity by Albert Speer's Nazi architecture, by the very openly panoptic house of Her Majesty's Government Signal Intelligence and Cheltenham, or by the new Apple headquarters that Norman Foster's was instructed to devote in its entirety, from every knob to its master plan, to the graphic perfection claimed by the company. The dome of the headquarters of the French Communist Party, drawn by Oscar Niemeyer in 1971, borrowed from all the codes that we have just seen. From Niemeyer's, its role is to embody mankind in its universality, but also to recall the curve of the globe, and I quote, to appear as a fecundity bearing mankind's emancipation. Which brings us, of course, full circle to Gaia's representation of the womb and the world. It is this boundless semiotic fluidity that allows, one would imagine, the French Communist Party to rent its concert hall to Jean-Paul Gaultier and Prada for their runway shows. And in literature, allegorical representation can be found, for instance, at the heart of Zola's Naturalist Manifesto, which aimed for scientific study of French society through literature. And in this manifesto, it would state, we consider that man cannot be differentiated from his environment, that he is made whole by his clothing, his house, his town, his country, and consequently, we won't note a single phenomenon of his spirit or his heart without looking for its causes or effects in the environment. Once again, space and something that is external to it function entirely together. I may not have time to read the whole, this whole quote from Proust. He has quite long sentences, but suffice it to say that this allegorical vision of space is very important to him. It is a cornerstone of his spatial poetics, as each place name for his narrator seems imbued with a taste of butter or with a streak of orange light. For the narrator, places are also animated by the aristocrats who wear their names like jewels, and the Duchesse de Guermantes in this quote embodies and is reflected in all the places, the castles that bear her name. Fourth category, the dynamic aspect of space, and as you can see, there is five, but they can play easily with each other and different examples. And my thoughts on this one have their roots in the space of theater on the stage, and the works from Beaumarchais to Ionesco, because their characters have a fondness for hiding behind obstacles, stacking chairs by the dozens, barricading themselves behind doors, and using darkness to shroud their identity. These are clever physical manipulations. Space here isn't a passive decor, it's an essential agent of the story, and I believe Patrick will tell us much more about this in his own talk. And obviously, this is not true only in plays, but also in narrative. Think of stories of labyrinths, which can be dense forests or post-apocalyptic cities, all of which can capture, isolate, and liberate a character according to the author's whim. Space is not separated from the storyline. I don't want to be too long, but here's another quote from La Jalousie. And narrator is still looking at his wife, spying on her. She has now taken refuge even further to the right in the angle of the room, which is also to the southeast angle of the house. It would be easy to observe her through one of those two doors, that of the central hall or that of the bathroom. But the doors are wood paneled without a system of jalousie that would let one see through. As for the blinds on the three windows, none now permits to see anything at all. As you can see, this is another instance of a labyrinth, a visual one, a sort of game the story plays with the narrator in order to frustrate him of his goal, that is to prove the infidelity of his wife. Space here is inserted between two characters to prevent their physical or sensory contact, to postpone or prevent the resolution of the plot. And the need for a fifth aspect of space became clear only at a later stage, as I was trying to draw a clear line between what is space, what is object, what is knowledge. But it became evident that the arts, sciences, and techniques of space often are central subjects in a story. Architecture, urbanism, agriculture, geography, cartography, astronomy, navigation, ethnology, history, but also hunting, fishing, tourism, criminology, and football are fields that depend on a specific and specialized appropriation of space. And that is why this aspect looks at how space is represented as the origin of knowledge or as a source of its application. For instance, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, after having landed on his desert island without practical knowledge of any sort, manages to extract countless lessons from his environment. This allows him to exploit the island through work, leadership, and slavery, to gain sizable profits and even to appropriate the land politically. In the same way, fictional builders and engineers and investors can give shape to the narrative through their own projects. This would be the Derelict Fixer-Upper in Régent Ducharme's Va Savoir, the monumental bridge in Mélis de Kerangal's Naissance d'un Pont, or the very cynical platform in which Michel Houellebecq stages the material and human exploitation of southern countries by Western corporations. One could become rich, or so goes the novel, by inventing and expanding a network of beach resorts where physical pleasure would replace the weak palliatives of exercise and local culture. While I could only give you a general overview of my approach of these 5 filters, it may be sufficient to suggest the range of spatial strategies that stand at the heart of most narratives. Strategies that guide a story's progress, its form, its content, its themes, its genre. As such, no space pre-exists the text. It is every time something that is built from the ground up. Even real places like Vancouver or Paris are transformed by the narrator's attentions or silences. Characters don't inhabit the same cities we do. It is because literary worlds are built piece by piece that we should not consider them as rigid, stable givens, but as the evolving sum of an active process of spatial representation, as an architecture. It's through that perspective that we can truly understand the role and the value of spatial poetics, not only for literary studies, but for any discipline mindful of the way narratives can shape nations, borders, territories, their foundation, their conquest, and their liberation. Thank you. We'll be moving on to our next talk.
Hello, everyone. My voice may be slightly frayed because I just came from teaching 2 Zoom classes. So I think I've spent a lot of it, but maybe to me, it sounds a bit more romantic now. So maybe it's a good thing. So I'm going to take you back in time in my presentation to a time of war, exploration, colonization, and global exchange, to the Renaissance, which embraced new technologies and reshaped the early modern world. The global space took new proportions, leaving room for the unknown and for new social and scientific advances, for artists, authors, playwrights, explorers, and inventors to imagine and build new worlds. So in the next image, we're going to be looking at the works of Stradanus. During the late 16th century, Johann Stradanus, a Flemish Mannerist painter and draftsman, created an extraordinary series of engravings called the New Inventions of Modern Times, the Nova Reperta. In this, he presented 20 inventions or discoveries of the early modern period, which he regarded as particularly important for the age. Many of these misleadingly termed new inventions, or even the word discoveries, originated outside of Europe long before the Renaissance. However, they appear intermingled with more recent technologies, their commonality residing in their importance as agents of change. These range from the stirrup to the iron clock, to the desolation of a promising cure for syphilis from plants newly discovered in the Caribbean, to silk production, which originated in China. Now, as you can see in this image, which is the frontispiece, the title page of the series, what at first appears as a out-of-place dead branch on the left side is actually a mulberry tree, which represents the discovery of silk production, an expensive luxury item that was sought after across the world. Now, the tree is non-native to Europe, but it is essential for silk production since its leaves were used to feed the silkworms and its branches to support the cocoons. So here you'll see, like in the middle, right at the center, the cannon and the relationship with gunpowder. You'll see distillation equipment as well to the right. To the very most left, you see in the background the iron clock. You see the stirrups. And so you see this variety of elements that mix science and technology, and of course, a map of the world that come from all parts of the globe. So in the next image, what you're going to be looking at is a representation of silk production. And this was a job primarily accomplished by female workers. As you can see in the image, you have only women represented, I believe. And we can see their techniques, which accurately depict methods of productions used from ancient China, even as it slightly romanticizes the process by showing the women wearing expensive clothes, which they wouldn't have worn in reality. Now, from the boiling of the cocoons for easy removal of the insects to the extraction of the silken threads and their eventual winding onto the reels, you see step by step how silk production was done. So really, it's amazing the level of detail that he captured in these images. And I'm gonna share with you one more of those images. The next one is on copper plate. And other inventions in the series featured as well, for example, the compass, gunpowder, spectacles, oil painting, copper engraving, which is the one you have here, attesting to the cross-cultural and inventive milieu of the period. Touching on subjects of medical, navigational, astronomical, and geographical relevance, Stradano's engravings highlighted, among other things, the mechanical innovations that reshaped how knowledge, both verbal and visual, was produced, reproduced, and transmitted. The images represent a combination of pen and ink, highlighted with white pigment to create incredibly detailed renderings. This series is remarkable, not only in regards to its theme, which was unprecedented at the time, but also for its naturalistic and functional representation of the world. With the next image, one of its most salient characteristics is that it's a condensed step-by-step view of the production process of most inventions, which you can readily see here as well. And in this invention of the printing press, what you have is the result is an elaborate depiction of these new technologies, which simultaneously disseminated knowledge and contributed to the enrichment of the genre of representation itself. From the left, we can see the artisans setting the typeface, referring to the author's copy placed on the wall. You see the images of the pages on the side, starting from the left. For each page, compositors chose each individual character, letters, spaces, punctuation marks, and they set the text line by line, placed backwards in a frame. The image reveals in detail every step of the process, from proofreading the text, which you see in sort of like the second layer. You see that there's a man sort of reading, holding a page in his hands, all the way to the right, where the printer applies the ink to the text with leather ink balls. And then it is set in the press above a dampened sheet of paper, and the press is brought down into the paper, and you see that the man is putting all his weight into the press, all the weight into that bar to make the best impression possible of the ink and paper. The pages are then hung to dry, and you see them as well sort of behind his head. They're drying there on some string. They're then put in order and eventually carried into town. So again, we get immersed into this whole world, and we see step by step how they achieve this. Now, as Leah Marchi, a specialist of Stradano's, posits, at the Medici court in Florence, where Stradano's resided, he would have encountered objects from, texts about, and images of the New World, making the prints repositories of factual and fictional information. The results is the convergence of various sources and mediums, blurring the lines between genres and art forms to reflect a changing context. If you could please pass the next image. Great. So here you have sort of this encounter of a variety of scientific elements as well as elements of imagination. Moreover, the series testifies to the transfer of material and visual culture taking place between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, highlighting the interconnected nature of an increasingly globalized early modern world. During the 17th century, international trade was rapidly evolving into networks that brought all areas of the globe in contact with each other. Demand for silver, gold, sugar, spices, silks, cotton, and even porcelain drove trade so that products from each major global region could be found virtually everywhere else. Europe not only moved commercial objects, but also began moving themselves Europeans not only moved commercial objects, but also began moving themselves and forcibly moving others into new places, while empires expanded their reach as they experienced profound economic turmoil, such as Spain's royal bankruptcies. So here we have a different plate, which is part of the same collection of inventions and discoveries. And it's encapsulating this expansionist spirit in visual form. It's one of Stradamus' most renowned and disseminated images, and it's devoted to the so-called discovery of America. It visualizes Americo Vespucci's first encounter with America, represented as a nude indigenous woman in a hammock. In the background, cannibals roast human flesh while exotic animals roam. The engraving represents a combination of symbolic imagery with written legends in Latin that read, "Americus rediscovers America. He called her once, and thenceforth she was always awake." Michel de Certeau offers a provocative description of this image in his The Writing of History. And I quote, "Americo Vespucci, the voyager, arrives from the sea. A crusader standing erect, his body in armor. He bears the European weapons of meaning, a cruciform staff with a banner bearing the Southern Cross, a navigational astrolabe, and a sword, each of this referring to discourses of mastery, religious truth, scientific truth, military power. Behind him are the vessels that will bring back to the European West the spoils of a paradise. Before him is the Indian America, a nude woman reclining in her hammock, an unnamed presence of difference, a body which awakens within the space of exotic fauna and flora. An inaugural scene, after a moment of stupor, on this threshold dotted with colonnades of trees, the conqueror will write the body of the other and trace there his own history. From her, he will make a history bodied of his labors and phantasms. She will be Latin America." Adding to its complexity, in the next image, we have a reversal of the previous scene. And Luis Montrose highlights how, in terms of the pictorial space, the scene of cannibalism, which you see, if you see directly down the center into the background, that's where you see the smoke, right, and the scene of the cannibals, which appears pushed into this background of the image, is perspectively distanced in terms of the pictorial surface. However, it is placed at the very center of the visual field, between the mutual gazes of Americus and America, and directly above the latter's outstretched arm. Thus, the interplay between the foreground and the background scenes of Stradamus' compositions, and this is Gall's inverted print, or reprint rather, of the first image, gives iconic form to characterizing Europe's encounter with the New World. An oscillation between fascination and repulsion, likeness and strangeness, desire to destroy and to assimilate the other. Notably, although most of Stradamus' engravings depict human figures in a realistic manner, this one deviates from the norm by featuring an allegorical representation of America in feminine form, woman as the embodiment of the marginal other. Occupying a privileged place in the imagination of the viewer, the romanticized feminine as foreign and yet familiar becomes focal to understanding the representation of contact between peoples and cultures. As theorist Johann Walsh Scott clarifies, gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power. Underscoring this illustration of the discovery of America, a commercial enterprise motivated by the search of new trade routes and material wealth, the woman's body, here again in its abstraction, emerges as a recurrent medium, a conduit for discourses of artistic production, material and territorial possession, and national identity. From another perspective, the feminine figure could be read to occupy an intermediary role as both thematic subject and material object within creative and imperial enterprises, an intermediary not without agency. The themes that emerge in recounting the engravings are reflective of the broader questions I explore in my own research. How did artists represent a world in flux that was increasingly interconnected? And how did these changes transform, in turn, their own modes of production? What role did the representation of marginal subjects, and in particular women, play in the reflection and understanding of a mutable world shaped by transnational encounters and intercultural exchanges? My research ranges from the transatlantic to the Mediterranean, which you see featured here, where politics, war, trade, and diverse cultures converge. I study the capacity of literature and the visual arts to construct these complex worlds and relationships, allowing readers and viewers to see them and experience them vividly. It may be enough to let you know that working on the plays and short stories of authors such as Cervantes, which feature characters that constantly cross cultural, national, and linguistic boundaries, I am able to study how women, for example, use money and trade to manipulate treacherous pirates, free their lovers by paying ransoms, use their keen knowledge of cultural codes of society, both high and low, to exert their agency and create new spaces of mobility. But this is a story for another time. Thank you.
Well, hello. Thanks a lot to my co-presenters. Fantastic job, and thanks to all of you for being here on a Thursday afternoon. I want to talk about law. I don't want to put you off too much. I want to talk about text of law. And the idea that I want to discuss is how increasingly some judges of mostly I'll be talking about the European Court of Human Rights, but judges who are dealing with questions of human rights are building their judgments in a way that I call dialogical. So legal judgments, or also called legal opinions, are those texts where judges construct their own authority. The judgments are those texts where they explain the reasons why they decide what they do. And so there is one way of thinking about these judgments that conventionally assumes that they must construct a very powerful voice, a very strong authorial voice that is sometimes called monological. So in contrast to this conventional view, I want to suggest that there is a new way of thinking about how judges construct their authority that I'm calling dialogical. And that's what I'm trying to pursue today a little bit. So if we can move to the next slide. So I need a little bit of a setup of the story, and I begin with a very famous quote from James Boyd White, who spearheaded an understanding of law as fundamentally rhetorical and literary in character. So he said, in every opinion, a court not only resolves a particular dispute one way or another, but it validates or authorizes one form of life, one kind of reasoning, one kind of response to argument, one way of looking at the world and its own authority, or indeed another. So legal opinions or legal judgments are world-making. They constitute worlds. And as such, we might inquire about them, how it is that they do that constitutive function. For example, we might ask about rhetoric, about the construction of voice, about style and performance, about atmosphere and emotional landscapes, about scenery, staging, and character. Concerning the construction of the judicial voice, that's what I'm going to be talking about. As I said, the conventional view is that judges must be able to speak with a very strong, authoritative, and univocal voice. If we go to next slide now. And so, Vincent, if you can go to the next slide. All right. Oh, sorry, the earlier one, sorry. So this is a seminal article by Robert Ferguson in 1990s, where he mentioned that, or he described the style of these judgments, and he said that the tonal, methodological, and rhetorical life of judicial opinions is a strong monologic voice that works to appropriate all other voices into its own authorial frame. Right? It's a very famous and seminal description. And according to Ferguson, what he said is that, yes, alternative views might be raised, but entirely within the controlling voice of the judicial speaker. The judicial speaker tries to control all the rest of the voices. And obviously this rings true to much of judicial texts, if you have had the chance to read them, that are produced. But alongside this conventional form, in recent decades, the style of judicial decisions has shifted, mostly with the use of computers and the use of the cut and paste function, and the actual writing mostly left to law clerks rather than judges. So in this new style of judgment, the voice of the judge is less conspicuous. It relies heavily on footnotes and the cut and paste function of the word processors to borrow text from other judgments. So if we go to the next slide. So it's a phenomenon of cutting and pasting, right? Which of course affects judges as well. So this is a fast forward to 2016. This is a great book by Paul Kahn, Making the Case, the Art of the Judicial Opinion. And what he's describing there is that opinions are getting much longer, and they are largely composed by stringing together quotations from prior opinions. It is as if writing an opinion has become a task of cutting and pasting. And this kind of writing is a kind of confused rendering, he says, of the tradition of suppression of the individual voice. Kahn compares this kind of writing with the blackmailer's note, which is composed by the cuts from magazines, which has no recognizable signature or a distinctive voice. So in what follows, what I want to do is to somewhat subvert these assumptions about judicial opinions. Namely that when we do have a voice, the voice needs to be strongly monological. And when we do not have a voice, but a patchwork of multiple citations, then the judgment shows a total lack of character and style. So instead, what I will speak about is judgments which are constructed in what Mikhail Bakhtin will call double voice discourse or dialogical discourse. In this new style of writing, judges do not rely on their own authorial voice, but build their authority on the shoulders of others. And if we move to the next slide, I'm going to be talking about a case, a famous case of the European Court of Human Rights called Vincent v. the UK. It's a case where mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole in the UK were declared to be contrary to the European Convention of Human Rights, contrary to the Article 3 that you have there, right? As being a kind of treatment that it's either inhuman or degrading punishment. What the court did was not to declare that mandatory life sentences themselves are contrary to this article, but rather they might be so if they never contemplate the possibility of a review. And in a separate concurring opinion, and we might perhaps go to the next slide, this has been called the right to hope. I'm not going to go through the entire citation, but just for you to have a look at the citation. The Irish member of the court who was writing a concurrent opinion, so not the majority voice of the court, but something which supplemented the court's judgment, said that those who commit the most abhorrent and egregious of acts nevertheless retain their fundamental humanity and carry within themselves the capacity to change. And more importantly, the hope that someday they might have atoned for the wrongs which they have committed. kind of a fundamental anthropological optimism, which is associated with certain fundamental principles of criminal law and rehabilitation and so forth. So the language of these Irish judges is actually very beautiful and uplifting, I will suggest, but the problem with it is that it can be contested normatively. It can create some controversy. So let's move to the next question. So the problem there is that the domestic courts in the UK, right, where mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole were contemplated, had argued already that, of course, the assessment of what counts as, just punishment or human or degrading punishment can legitimately produce answers in different countries, and indeed different answers at different times in the same country. So again, the idea that this is kind of a contested territory normatively, and so what is the authority of a European judge to come to the UK to tell them how is that they have to deal with their business? Therefore, normally, what the European Court has to say, or tends to say, is that countries have what they're called a margin of appreciation. They don't want to create a one-size-fits-all normative framework for all, but they allow them to have their own opinion. But then the question is, how is then the court build its own authority to declare that, in this case, the UK's legislation violates the convention? How can the court build its own authority if not based on a very monological authoritarian argument? And if we go to the next slide, the answer I want to provide is that what it does is it weighs its own opinion with the judgment of others. Rather than using its own opinion, what it does, it brings the opinions of many courts along the world. So, for example, it cites tribunals, including Canada, South Africa, Hong Kong, Namibia, in order to weave its own opinion. I'm going to just highlight two of those opinions, and one is internal to the UK, right? So you're trying to declare that the UK law is contrary to the convention, and therefore it increases your persuasive power, I guess, if you try to bring some voices from within that domestic system. So in a different case, the UK court had written that a prisoner's incarceration without hope of release is like a sentence of death. He can never atone for his offense. So that's kind of one pillar of the argument. And the other case that they bring is a case of Germany, and this had to do with some Nazis who had been sentenced to life. And the federal court in Germany in 1977 said that respect for human dignity and the rule of law is possible only when the prisoner is given a concrete and realistically attainable chance to regain their freedom at some point in time, right? So it is only after the European Court cites these other judgments that it now begins to speak its own voice, to utter its own judgment. But it does so by using what I'm again calling a double voice discourse and using the language of others to construct its own authority. Let's move to the next slide. So this is kind of the operative moment of the judgment. So rather than speak with their own voice, what the court says, and I mentioned it, I'm using the term borrowed authority. So this is the court speaking, saying, if such a prisoner is incarcerated without any prospect of release and without the possibility of having his life sentence reviewed, there is a risk that he can never atone for his offense. Like, this is exactly the same language that was being used in the UK. Whatever the prisoner does in prison, however exceptional his progress towards rehabilitation, his punishment remains fixed and unreviewable. And the second point that they do, and this is just kind of the same, the next paragraph is, furthermore, as the German Constitutional Court had said in the case that I had cited, it will be incompatible with the provision of human dignity for the state forcefully to deprive a person of his freedom without at least providing him with the chance to someday regain his freedom. So in the operative part of the judgment, they're not using their own voice, but citing the voices of others. So I'm just going to conclude with a very two simple points. If we go to the final slide. So what I want to say is that these building judgments dialogically, what it does is it evolves, it eschews the monological authority of the single voice, one. And second, as I understand it, or as I try to elaborate it in my work, I don't understand that as a suppression of the individual voice, but rather as the expression of a democratic ethos in a pluralistic society. And I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Pause for applause for a moment. So hello, my name is Patrick. I am going to try and bring us all home and sort of weave these together a little bit as I talk about the art and practice of scenic design. Vincent, next slide, please. Shoot. Oh, sure. Let's go back one. Sorry, I had mine out of order. I apologize. We'll sit here for a minute. So what is scenic design? Right, in the most basic form, the designer is responsible for imagining the physical, and these days virtual, surroundings in which the action or the story takes place. And this has shifted a lot over the past 5 years, even more so over the past 10 or 15 years, and it has shifted enormously. The way in which this happens has shifted enormously over the past 60 and 70 years. Next slide, Vincent, thank you. So here's a picture of a show called Money, Grub, and Whores. Sometimes the job of the scenic designer is to make an incredibly strong naturalistic choice, right? To create a space that is as honest and as dirty and as detailed as the people and the lives of the people that are living in that space. That's sometimes the best choice we can make. We hope the audience engages with it in a way that they say, I know that place, I've been there. I know exactly what that chair feels like. And they can put themselves in the story in a very personal way. We've given them a lot of the information to just let them ease comfortably into this space. Next slide, please, Vincent. Here's sort of the opposite, right? This is a story. This is a play called Sex and Education. And sometimes it's our job as designers to build more suggestive worlds, to create a story that abstractly supports the play. So here we've got a high school teacher who's leaving the profession. She's going to go on and sell real estate. We've got a graduating senior who has been playing sports, will go off to college with a sports scholarship, both questioning the importance of education, both questioning if they've made any difference in the world so far. And so we capture this transitional moment in the lives of these two characters, right? As their page turns and they move on to something else. This, I would say, is more representative of how we're crafting the art form these days for a lot of things. And so here we give the audience enough to ground themselves. We give them this pretty typical school floor that they can say, oh, I know where that is. I know that floor. But we let them fill in the rest of the blanks. We let them build the room around these characters as time evolves. Next slide, please. So here's what I would call my pretty standard definition of scenic design: a physical manifestation of an intellectual or emotional response to a story, script, or prompt. Again, it could be naturalistic, it could be suggestive, but it is a response. It is a physical response that we as artists have. And so what I'd like to do today is take you through a bit of a process for that. Thank you, Vincent. Is to take you through a bit of a process for that. So here we're looking at kind of the pipeline for what is a creative process, what it takes to build a world. We'll sit here for a minute, and if you look at the right-hand side, the sort of experiment, evaluate, edit, and the implementation, that's probably the part that most people are familiar with, right? That's the very end of this process, the part where we do things that actually lead to the building, the physical building of this world. What I'd like to do is start a little bit earlier in the process and sort of give everybody a peek behind the curtain. You are brilliant, Vincent, thank you. And give everybody a bit of a peek behind the curtain. So I think it takes three things. There are three sort of tenets of what makes a good creative process, right? Craft, we obviously have to be, we have to master the elements and principles of design as any artist or designer would. We have to have a deep desire to sort of drink in the world around us, to engage in ways with our physical surroundings that we may overlook in our everyday. We have to sort of look into the corners of the world. The second would be a collaborator. This is absolutely a collaborative process. This is a collaborative experience. We build these worlds together. And so the role of the designer is actually to come with ideas, to come to the table with some thoughts and ideas. The third would be retrospection. This is often the part of the process that even those that are very engaged in it forget. We have to allow ourselves time and space at the end of this process to sit back and see what that journey was like, what worked and what didn't, how we change it going forward. What part of that creation that we made will we take with us on the next one? So the design is the product, but the building of the worlds is the process. Let's sit here for one more minute, please, Vincent. Back one more, yeah, sorry, thank you. So this is the first one, right? Explore. Explore. This is where I take what Vincent has sort of offered in the beginning, and I do my deep dive. A designer does a deep dive into story. Sure, we read it a lot of times, but we're not just reading it for prescriptive purposes. We're not just reading it to find out where the doors are, where the architecture is. Vincent sort of gave us a great foundation here. We are actually looking for clues. We're looking to see what the language of this piece is, or this prompt is. Is it vernacular? Is it poetic? We're looking for any visual styles, any landmarks that may be present in this piece. Is it representational? Is it lifelike? How does time move in this world? Does time move in this world? How do characters move in this space? Do they move? Is it a linear story? Is it a non-linear story? Are there any specific rules to this world that we can use to pull out as clues for building blocks later on? What's the first image that we see, that we feel? What's the last image? How do we get from that first image to the last image? Why is that journey? What is that visual journey, and why is it important to the story? What's the venue? What is the actual architecture that we are going to be presenting this piece in? Is it a theater? Is it a classroom? Is it a schoolyard? Is it a courtroom? What are the actual walls of this place, and how do we use the physical architecture to help us tell part of this story? So this is the exploration process, right? This is where we go in really, really, really hard with our heads, and we figure out what can we pull out of this script? What is the script giving us that we can use going forward? Next slide, please, Vincent. And this is where we have to do something with that information, right? This is where we actually have to get a bit tangible, take all of that information we've pulled out of the script and distill it down into an idea. These are just some examples of ways to do that. Big complex texts may take spreadsheets. Texts that have a lot of movement or motion, stories that have a lot of coming and going, characters appearing and disappearing, might be a little bit more like the top left image. We're sort of looking at how does this play track? Where is everybody coming from and going? Are there any clues there? The image on the top right is more about what's the important moment in each scene? Are there micro moments in each of these plays, and are they built on each other to tell a story, or are they separate from each other that we are being charged with weaving together as creators to help put a bit of a frame on a story? Next slide, please. And so the distillation of the big idea is probably the hardest part, right? This is where we are tasked with coming in with a thesis statement or a spine line. This is the way we come up with a framework for how we're going to go and tell this story. For me, this should have a sense of action or poetry. I think this moment having a sense of action or poetry leads to a pretty dynamic world building experience that goes beyond just being a prescriptive in nature. 2 or 3 sentences, the themes I'm going to illustrate and how I'm going to illustrate them. So is this a big sweeping world? Is this a closed and cold world? Is this a bright and airy world? This is the part of the process that leads to world building that is sometimes unseen. This is the part of the process that if we really spend our time here, I think we can engage and connect with audiences in deeper ways than simply offering them a place in which they're familiar and comfortable to engage with the story. A good idea of this, a good way to talk about this is Romeo and Juliet. Read the story once, great. I know I'm going to go out, I'm going to look for images of Verona, and there's a balcony, and there's you know, two families, and that's where I start, right? And I build a world up from that. If I do a deep exploration of the script and distill it down to a big idea, I might come up with something a little more with a sense of action, right? Star-crossed lovers, go a little further, add a sense of conflict to that. Star-crossed lovers whose suicide helps mend a divided Verona, right? That's a little bit more poetic. There's a sense of action there. That world is going to be built quite differently from a world that starts with 1500s Verona balcony, and on from there. That's where the research starts. That's when the research comes in. That's when I don't start looking for doors and windows and balconies, but I start looking for divide, mending, lovers. Sure, I sprinkle in Verona, I sprinkle in balconies, but at the heart of that really is the emotional way into that script. Next slide, please, Vincent. And so here are some images, some research images for a show that was called On the Other Side of the River. The press release for this show: a provincial girl raised in a small river town by her blinded devout grandfather. She is on the cusp of womanhood, ready to declare her independence. But when her grandfather dies and she finds herself alone, she doesn't know which way to turn until she meets the luminous, mysterious stranger who lives on the other side of the river. So that in itself has a sense of poetry, a sense of action to it. But for this scenic design, right, it was important for us to go a little bit deeper. How do we build that world? How do we tell that story? What story is that? So in this scenic design, we chose to explore the relationship between the movement and the stillness, between the light and the dark. The design builds on the space, which had a low and wide architecture, and it creates an all-encompassing environment that evokes femininity, movement, the fluidity of water, and the haze of memory, right? So by engaging with a text in this way, we come up with these images, as opposed to simply images of womanhood or a grandfather or a specific small town. Next slide, please. This is where we start to actually play, right? This cycle, this iterative cycle, experiment, evaluate, and edit. This is the do and respond phase of where we start to build world. How do we now take all of this, this thought, these images, these words, how do we take them and actually build up a world from this? How do we engage with an audience now? And so this cycle of experiment, evaluate, and edit gives us something to test that thesis statement again, right? We can try ideas here. We can explore and experiment with actual physical ideas here and test it against that thesis statement to see if we are achieving the goal we set out for ourselves. This is a time where we are entering that liminal space between being pretty heady, being pretty artistic, and actually being a bit more design oriented and worrying about things like the actual space and how we're going to put things into a space. This is the time where nothing is precious, right? This is a great playtime in the creative process. Next slide, please, Vincent. And so these are the tools we use, right? This is where we might be a little bit more familiar. We start playing with pencil. We start playing with little tiny maquettes and models to explore how people move in a space, if the feeling of that space evokes what we're hoping it evokes, if it achieves the sense of atmosphere that we're hoping it achieves. Next slide, please, Vincent. Here's a couple more examples of maquettes or digital renderings, which we are certainly doing these days. Next slide, please, Vincent. And so this is where we sit for a long time. And the deeper we dive into this space, the more we can play, the more we can make sure that if our product meets our thesis statement, we have a better chance of knowing that perhaps the audience too will understand on some level our engagement with why we built this world. Next slide, please, Vincent. And this is the implementation part. This is the part that may perhaps be most familiar to everyone. Next slide, please, Vincent. This is things like drafting, props list, what's going to be touched, what else is the audience going to see, what's it going to look like, how are we going to paint it. But again, this is the very end of the cycle. This is the very end of the pipeline before we get here. Next slide, please. So here are two images of the show on the other side of the river. This was sort of what that research came out to look like. It was, again, a low squat space, and we played with the concepts of femininity. We engaged with the text to pull out ideas of memory and haze, how the audience was to interact with this space. One more, Vincent. And we did actually wind up taking a chance, because for us, it was about memory. It was about the haze of memory, the obscurity of vision. What happens? How do we simulate a river on stage? How do we simulate drowning going into a river on stage? So playing with physical elements and visual elements and the space, we were able to manipulate the world in this way, build the world in a way to allow for this. Next slide, please. Here's a quote that the show received. I won't read it out loud to you, but with this quote, I hope that I make clear the role of the designer can play in building worlds. It's much deeper than simply responding prescriptively to the needs of the text. It's about a deep and active engagement with the creative team, the script, examining the character, the theme, the emotions, the movements, etc., and creating a physical world where words, actions, and the physical environment work together to take the audience on a journey, a place where content and tone meet. And that's the process that I use to build worlds and help connect with audiences. Hopefully audiences engage with the worlds in a way that is meaningful specifically to the audience. Thank you.